If you were gaming in the 1990s or have at least gone back to try out some of the classic games of the time, you already know that the platformers of this era just had something special about them. From Super Mario World to Donkey Kong Country, Yoshi's Island, and so many others in between, this really was the timeline where it was just about impossible not to fall in love with these games. I was born in 1992 and had an older brother who was already into gaming when I became capable of holding a controller. So Mario, Kirby, and DK were my friends before I'd even had a chance to make it to preschool to make real-world ones. Naturally, my nostalgia for this time period in video games is sky high. All of this is why I simply had to get Windswept in my hands as soon as I saw a Reddit comment that likened the game's demo to Yoshi's Island. Pound for pound, Yoshi's Island might be my actual favorite platformer of all time. So if Windswept had the same vibe, you could count me in. After beating Windswept, I can see the vision. In truth, it really feels like a mix of Yoshi's Island, Super Mario World, Sonic the Hedgehog, Celeste, 2D Kirby, and Donkey Kong Country. These comparisons aren't hard to find, as developers Weatherfell themselves cite all but Sonic on the game's original Kickstarter page as inspiration. The parallels are there, yet Windswept feels like its own thing, too. The question then becomes, does Windswept soar high enough to enter the same conversation as these all-time great video game platformers? Well, no, but expecting that degree of perfection here wouldn't be fair anyway. What Windswept does present is a charming, adorable love letter to the era genre that will also eventually destroy you with its difficulty out of nowhere. Let's talk about it.
90s charm for days.
Launching into Windswept feels like blowing into an SNES cartridge, clicking it into your console, and watching the colors start to flicker on your CRT TV. The 90s style that developers Weatherfell were going for here truly shines through in every facet of the game's design overall. The soundtrack deserves a special shout-out because it's an actual retro-style masterpiece. Platformers of the old days didn't have much in the way of story, and Windswept follows suit here too. Marbles the duck hatches from an egg, is swept away from his home by a tornado, and soon bumps into Checkers the turtle. The two team up, and you'll use them both in tandem to try to find a way back home by the end of the game. Launching into Windswept feels like blowing into an SNES cartridge, clicking it into your console, and watching the colors start to flicker on your CRT TV. The 90s style that developers Weatherfell were going for here truly shines through in every facet of the game's design overall. The soundtrack deserves a special shout-out because it's an actual retro-style masterpiece. Platformers of the old days didn't have much in the way of story, and Windswept follows suit here too. Marbles the duck hatches from an egg, is swept away from his home by a tornado, and soon bumps into Checkers the turtle. The two team up, and you'll use them both in tandem to try to find a way back home by the end of the game. It's not any deeper than that ever, just like trying to save Princess Peach in Mario or retrieving your bananas in Donkey Kong aren't exactly super layered narrative masterpieces either. Sure, Celeste pulled off the retro platformer style while weaving a wonderfully emotional through line during the whole experience, but I'm not about to knock Windswept for sticking to a more basic story formula here. The charm and strong nostalgic vibe of Windswept really never lets up at all. There's a Super Mario World-esque overworld where you'll scurry a sprite along to each new level, before jumping into each new biome that will once again look amazing and be buttressed by additional banger music track after banger music track. In total, there are 40 side-scrolling levels, and they're well mixed up throughout the journey. There are creature mounts along the way in certain sections, like a dolphin, bat, or puppy. These function much like Yoshi in Mario, or the rhino and swordfish in DK Country. They're usually not necessary to complete a level, but they add another layer to movement and give you one additional HP hit you can tank if you need to. The exception to the optional mount designation is the puppy, whose levels feel mechanically identical to a minecart section in Donkey Kong. Just like a minecart challenge, I expect these parts of Windswept to be a bit divisive, as the 90s wonkiness you remember from these levels in DK is alive and well in Windswept too.
Fluid and demanding platformer mechanics.
Minecart-inspired puppies aside, Windswept features a pretty absurdly deep platformer moveset that encourages experimentation and quick thinking, eventually demanding that you become a true expert with the mechanics in the end. Marbles and checkers can both be your lead character and be swapped around with the press of a button. Marbles can glide and also throw checkers to hit enemies from a distance. Checkers can ground pound as well as throw marbles upwards into the air in order to reach ledges that are otherwise inaccessible with a normal jump. Combine all of this together, and you end up with a deceptively straightforward enough set of moves that becomes a fast-paced, character-swapping, button-inputting frenzy once you start to understand how you can chain everything together. Easy to learn, difficult to master is a pretty cliché phrase in video game criticism, but that's really what's at play in Windswept. Every single move you can do is explained in the game's opening level, and then isn't mentioned again. Weatherfell shows you the ropes, then trusts you enough to figure out how to really put everything into action. I like this choice for the most part, but it'll be tough for some. This is retro design philosophy once again, harkening back to an age where we couldn't look up guides and weren't handheld for the majority of a gaming experience. Where this falls apart is in some of the levels in the back half of the game, where you're expected to start regularly implementing some of the really high-level, chained platforming mechanics that you've hopefully learned on your own along the way. It's a bit awkward, because the game makes a lot of these moves optional for a long time, except in secret challenge zones that you aren't at all required to complete as you work your way through all the levels. I'm a very proficient platformer, but there still were a handful of levels towards the end of the game that I frankly just straight up skipped because their required mechanical solutions were just too extreme for me to feel compelled to learn and internalize when I was already so deep into this 4 or 5 hour long experience.
Tons to do and collect.
Like any self-respecting 1990s platformer, Windswept gives you tons of things to work towards collecting if you want to eventually 100% the game. Cloud, Moon, Comet, and Star coins are all scattered throughout the levels, each with different required things you'll need to do in order to grab them all in one go. You'll collect the letters COMET much like KONG in DK. You'll get moons if you find and complete the optional bonus rooms hidden in each level. Gather enough cloud coins, and you'll be able to access the game's final challenge zone, much like the special area of Super Mario World. All of these collectibles are thought out and placed expertly, and frequently lead to a rewarding feeling of exploration being packed into the game non-stop. Of course, you don't have to collect everything if you don't want to, but completionists will be very pleased with all of the options and requirements in Windswept. Your expert collecting pays off at Lamp's Shade, a shop run by a friendly moth where you can exchange your star coins for things like packaged action figures of characters and enemies encountered throughout the game. Once purchased, you can choose to remove the figures from their boxes, then animate them in fun and charming ways. This boxed toy mechanic isn't necessary at all, but I love the attention to detail. You'll also collect vinyl records, each housing one of the 40 incredible tracks in the game that you can listen to at your leisure. There are little arcade games you can collect in Lamp's Shade too, as well as the ability to pay the moth a sum of coins in order to help you locate missed collectibles in levels you've already beaten. None of the things you'll encounter in Lamp's Shade need to exist in actuality, but they just further highlight the spirit and love that Weatherfell tried to pour into every single solitary ounce of this game. All of this goes such a long way to making Windswept seem like one of the most charming games of the year. And then, it will break you.
An ultimately ridiculous challenge. My ultimate biggest issue with Windswept, and also what sadly holds it back from genuine platformer greatness, is that the game gets absurdly, ridiculously difficult about 60% of the way through. And don't get me wrong, I love challenging platformers. I gave Bionic Bay a 10 earlier this year and enjoy the B-sides in Celeste. All of that said, it's just too much in a game like Windswept. It's going to be absolutely nutty to see how speedrunners optimize this game. For a game that feels just as warm, fuzzy, cozy, and lovely as a Super Mario World or Yoshi's Island for the entire first half of the journey, it's ultimately jarring and far too steep of a difficulty spike to see where the game ends up. You have unlimited lives and occasional checkpoints throughout each level, but it's still simply too much. At first, the real challenge of the game is relegated to the optional bonus rooms, with the levels themselves simply being fun romps to progress through. By the end, Windswept kind of feels like baby's First Kaizo game as you're dodging, ducking, and weaving through the slimmest of margins using the game's layered movement options to their absolute max potential. In some ways, I love this philosophy. It's going to be absolutely nutty to see how speedrunners optimize this game. On the other hand, I have to be honest and tell you that I spent far too many of the latter levels much more frustrated than I'd ever expected with just how in love I was with the first 50%. It ends up feeling like a shame, because I was ready to crown this title one of my personal games of the year before this massive spike. Windswept does offer a robust and detailed assists menu, and that's definitely a good thing. Many that try this game will need to toggle on at least a couple of these aids by the end, simply to be able to make it through to the final boss. The unfortunate thing is, the game just feels way less rewarding as you're toggling on invincibility, spawning in your own checkpoints, or skipping levels altogether because they're too frustrating otherwise. I loved this game for most of it, until it forced me to give in and use assists I'd always typically ignore completely in any other platforming experience. This felt extra disappointing in this case, because Windswept really is on the precipice of greatness. Closing comments. Windswept is an adorable ode to classic 1990s platformers, mostly for better but occasionally for worse. The charming design, stellar presentation, and fluid platforming mechanics are top-notch. Assists added to the game are thoughtfully included, especially because the game gets absurdly challenging by the end of the experience. This is a case of a near-flawless first act, but a second act that will leave many setting the controller down and walking away, or abusing assists just to see the game through. I still think it's one worth checking out for retro platformer fans, but I'm a bit bummed that what felt like a certified classic initially doesn't quite stick the landing in the end.